Good evening. Thank you all for coming. I certainly appreciate your being here, and I would like to extend my appreciation specifically to Lisa Reese, who made this all possible. Unfortunately, she can't be here tonight. And I also want to extend my appreciation to the staff of the Mark Twain Library who made this presentation possible. So thank you all. Two requests before I formally begin. One, if you have a cell phone, please turn it off so that when someone's interrupting you, you're not interrupting us. And secondly, if you have a question or comment, please hold it to the end so that we get there. Let's begin now. Let's play a game that I invented called Guess the Primate. I will play a primate sound. See if you can guess what animal is making the vocalization before I reveal to you the answer. Are you ready? Let's play. So as you can see, pretty much all primates are able to grunt or to bark or to howl or yelp, but only humans have the gift of speech. Only we have languages. And the reason for our dominance of the planet, 7.5 billion plus of us, only 385,000 at best of our closest relatives, is because we have this thing called speech. We weren't always so dominant on the planet. You can go back 10,000 years ago to about 8,000 BC, and the estimate is there were only 5 million humans on the whole planet. And it grew very, very slowly over the succeeding millennia. But then in the second half of the 1800s, it started to grow very rapidly. In the 20th century, it grew exponentially, and we continue that exponential growth in the 21st century. And all of this is due to the fact that we have a very specific form of communication, language, that allows us to pass information from me to you or you to me through a common system of symbol, signs, or behaviors. Yes, there is such a thing as body language. But when we think about our speech communication, Daniel Dennett, a professor of philosophy at Tufts University, has identified 5 major features of this speech in the book From Bacteria to Bach and Back, The Evolution of Minds. The first one that he identified was that it's communicative, which is obvious. It's its most basic feature. It allows us to command or request, inform, inquire, instruct, insult, inspire, intimidate, to placate, to seduce, to amuse, to entertain, and do a whole lot of other verbs as well. And it's productive. We only have a limited number of sounds that we can make. We call those phonemes. And we can take those phonemes and make morphemes, which is the linguistic term for words. And from those limited number of sounds and words, from phonemes and morphemes, we can create an unlimited number of phrases, of sentences, of paragraphs, etc. So it's terribly productive. And it allows for error correcting. So you don't have to hear every word I say. If you're reading an article, you can skip a word or a phrase here or there. And you know what? You'll still carry on understanding what the article was about. And it allows for displaced reference, which is just a fancy way of saying we could talk about something that's not right in front of us. So we could talk about something in another room here in the library, another building in Reading. We could talk about something on another planet. We could talk about something that happened in the past, something that might happen in the future, something that is hypothetical or even imaginary. And lastly, humans have an ease of acquisition when it comes to learning language. Any human infant from about 6 months to 18 months automatically will learn the language that's being spoken around them. No one has to teach that infant how to learn the language. And when we talk about speech, we use a bunch of different words to describe it. Let's begin with pidgin, the one at the bottom of the list. Pidgin is a form of a language that is rudimentary. It's a proto-language. It is formed typically when groups with different language come together and want to do something, specifically to trade, possibly to work together for a short period of time, and they create a pidgin. So think back to colonial times. The Dutch, the French, the English all wanted to trade with the Native Americans for their furs. And of course, the Native Americans had a variety of different languages. And so pidgins developed. A Creole is a more complex form of a proto-language. It typically occurred when different language groups were forced together for some period of time, possibly forever. And they had to kind of develop a language so they could communicate with each other. Think back again to colonial times, to the African slave trade, when members of many different African tribes speaking many different languages were brought to the New World and forced to live together and also to learn some of the words of their masters as well. And so a Creole develops. And a Creole over time can develop into a full-flung language. And then we have the last two, dialect and language. And they're problematic because no one knows where a dialect ends and a language begins. If you go to China, there is one major language. It's called Mandarin, spoken by over 900 million people as a native-born first language. And yet, if you took somebody from the Western provinces, some rural farmer or whatnot, and brought them to Beijing, they might not be understood in Beijing because their dialect is pretty thick as compared to the Beijing. You can go to Scandinavia. We got 4 different countries up there, Denmark and Sweden and Norway and the Netherlands. And you could take somebody from Denmark and put them in any of the other 3 countries. And you know what? They'd understand pretty much everything that's being said in those countries. And if they open their mouth to speak, they'd be understood. They would be considered to have a kind of strange accent, but they would be understood. 4 languages or 4 dialects. Well, the best definition that I've seen that what distinguishes a language from a dialect comes from the linguist Max Weinrich, and he said a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. And that's why in China we have a lot of dialects, but only one major language. And you go to the Scandinavian countries that I mentioned, and each of them has an army and a navy. Why did language begin? Big question, nobody knows the answer to that. How did it begin? Again, big question, nobody really has an answer. We've got a couple of different theories. One says is that it began slowly with our ancestors, 2 million years ago, probably with Homo erectus in this theory, which would be about 1.9 million years ago, and they started to develop tools, and that led to speech. And then there's another group that says, no, speech actually developed with some mutation that occurred within the last 200,000 years when Homo sapiens arose. I don't know the answer, but I can tell you more about how people make their choice as to which camp they're in. If you go back about 3.5 million years ago, you will see in Africa primitive stone flakes like this, which we consider stone tools, that were obviously made, at least that's what the anthropologists and archaeologists tell us, that were made by some type of a hominid. And although these stone tools, the one you're looking at here is from Kenya, 3.3 million years ago. It's known as the Lomkwi tool. Didn't change over its lifespan, so it's not clear that there was language involved and that you could have learned how to flake a stone just by imitating someone else. If we go forward a little bit in time, we have the Oldowan stone tools, 2.5 million to 1.7 million years ago, made by Australopiths, hominids, homos, we don't know. A little bit more complex than the tools that I showed you before this. Is this indicative of speech? I don't know. You could probably make these through imitation. And then we start about 1.8 million, 1.9 million years ago with the Acheulean stone tool culture. These particular, this hand axe that you're looking at there, fairly complex tool to make. This is not something that's easily learned by imitation, and it takes months for a modern human to learn how to do this, even with instruction. So is this indicative of speech? Could well be. We don't know. But these tools were in production from about 1,000,008, 1,000,009 years ago to as recently as 130,000 years ago. However, they didn't change much in that whole period. So it's logical to believe that this may have been learned through imitation and that people didn't really advance it. If they'd had speech, one thinks they probably would have made improvements. But we are fairly certain that by about 50 or 60,000 years ago, our ancestors were talking up a storm. And the reason for that is that about 100,000 years ago, Homo sapiens began to migrate out of Africa as well as through pretty much all parts of Africa. And first they went into the Middle East and then out into Asia and into Europe. On the Asian side, they made their way all the way down the Indonesian archipelago to the island of Flores by about 50 or 60,000 years ago. And then from there, they made a sea voyage across the Timor Sea. Right now, the Timor Sea is about 400 miles to Australia, but back then it was only about 100 miles because of lower sea levels. And anyway, a group made a trip across the sea. They couldn't know that Australia was out there, but they made the trip from Flores to Australia, and they colonized Australia. And in order to do that, we think that it required at least 25 and probably closer to 50 individuals, men, women, and children, in order to make that happen. And we believe that in order to construct the craft and then to sail the craft would have required language skills far beyond basic grunts or even a basic proto-language. When we look in Europe, at about 40,000, 45,000 years ago, we see the beginnings of cave paintings, of which there are many examples. And there are also many examples from a little bit more recently, about 35 to 40,000 years ago, of stone sculptures like this lion with a man's body and the bone flute. And they're indicative of probably fairly robust cultures, and we think that this is indicative of quite a bit of language. So the mutation that took us from a climbing primate 7 million years ago, 5 million years ago, to one that walked around on the jungle and forest floor that would eventually lead to us today is a long line of changes. And of course, you've all seen charts like this. They've been around for a long time. They should be modified to be more like this because we're evolving into something different. But all of these things are due to mutations in our DNA. Most mutations are of no consequence. They don't add a benefit and they don't kill the individual. Sometimes they do. Some mutations are lethal and the individual won't procreate. So the gene disappears. But sometimes we have genetic changes that occur slowly. As an example, if you look at Darwin's finches, right, they all evolved on their different islands and their different niches. Over hundreds of years, thousands of years. But sometimes mutations occur overnight that change things significantly. And the best example that I can show you of that is Oliver, chimpanzee, captured as an adult of about 3 years old, of a juvenile about 3 years old in 1960 in the Belgian Congo. He would live till 2012. He spent the rest of his life in captivity in the United States. And he was often referred to as the humanzee because people thought he might be a cross between a human and a chimpanzee. He didn't look like a normal chimpanzee. You can see his face is different. It's a little bit flatter, doesn't look quite like the normal chimpanzee, and his ears make him look like he's an extra from Star Trek, from the planet Vulcan. But the thing that most distinguished him from any other chimpanzee was that he didn't knuckle walk if he had a choice. He preferred to walk upright. So his pelvis was different. His DNA was looked at in the 1990s. He had 48 chromosomes, which meant he wasn't a cross between a human and a chimpanzee because he would have had 47. We have 46 chromosomes, so that's how you would have gotten 47. Unfortunately, he was never bred. So as a consequence, we might have been living on the planet of the apes, but not so much right now. But that first major change that anthropologists, archaeologists look at when they look at the fossil record was a change in the pelvis that allowed our ancestors to walk upright. And it changed a lot of other things. The spine changes, the lower limbs change, and of course our feet changed dramatically from grasping feet that allowed you to climb in the trees and hold on to limbs to these things that are marvelously designed for walking and running. And there were many other anatomical changes that occurred along the way. One of the ones that's most obvious to people is that our brains got bigger, our skulls changed shape, our faces got flatter, our teeth got smaller. And when you look in the record, what you see is that there's a direct correlation between when people started using fire, when we learned to control fire, probably led to cooking, which probably led to our larger brains. Because you could not exist with your large brain today if all you did was eat raw vegetables and even raw meat. You would not be able to consume enough calories in a day in order to maintain the 20% of your caloric intake that is applied to your neural functions. Many of the changes that took place along the way that allowed us to speak are related to soft tissue changes, which we have almost no record in the fossil evidence. We might have a hyoid bone from a Neanderthal, which is in the larynx. That's about it. We do know that our larynx is a descended larynx, which differentiates us from every other primate that we have ever examined. They all have the raised primate as shown there, which is supposed to be a Neanderthal. I don't know whether Neanderthals had a lowered or raised larynx. But if they did, does that mean that they couldn't speak? I don't know. Maybe they just couldn't utter as many phonemes as us, or maybe they had a more limited vocabulary. But the lowered larynx allows us to control our airways much more finely than other primates and helps to produce language. There were many other changes that occurred along the way too. Changes in our ear structure, changes in our brains, changes in our tongue and the muscles in our jaw. All of these things are things that must have occurred, but we really don't have an archaeological record of it. So you come to the question that I asked before, and I told you there were two schools. Did language occur slowly, evolving from Homo erectus and a proto-language beginning about 1.8 million, 2 million years ago, and then all of a sudden ramping up with us? Or did it begin more recently with the development of Homo sapiens about 200,000 years ago in Africa, and then kind of ramped up from there? I'm in the latter school, but I don't have any more evidence than anybody else. So now let's ask the really big question, why did language begin? Because all of the other animals on this planet, all of the other plants on this planet, and the bacteria, they all exist, they all procreate, they seem to survive for the most part. They do it without any real language. There are forms of communication, but they do it without language. So why did language begin? It's not necessary. And the answer to that is, I don't know, and nobody else does. But there are theories. The best theory I've ever heard comes from Lily Tomlin, who said language was developed because of our deep inner need to complain. Works for me. I mentioned soft tissue changes. Nowhere were the soft tissue changes more prominent than in our brains. In the 1860s, a guy named Broca discovered Broca's area on the left side of your brain. Your brain is divided into two hemispheres, left and right. The left hemisphere controls the right side of your body and vice versa. And he found on the left side this thing he called Broca's area in aphasic patients. When it was damaged, they didn't speak so well. And then Wernicke, about a decade later, discovered another area that in aphasic patients created problems. And since then, with the development of far more sophisticated brain imaging tools like fMRI and some other stuff, we've really gone to town to learn about the functions of our brain and where they exist. And what we found is almost all of our communication capability, our speech, are resident in the left hemisphere. Both the ability to understand language and the ability to produce language. And we think that that explains, to a large degree, if not entirely, why somewhere between 80 and 90% of all Homo sapiens are right-hand dominant. Otherwise, you would expect them to be 50-50, wouldn't you? When we look at the study of language, we call that linguistics, and it breaks down into 6 different areas. The study of sounds, phonetics. The study of the relationships among those sounds, we call that phonology. Morphology is the study of the forms of words. How do you decline a verb, etc. Syntax, which is how do you arrange words and phrases. We'll go into that a little bit more later. Semantics, which are what are the meanings of those phrases and words and sentences. And lastly, pragmatics, which is how does context affect people's understanding of meaning. As I mentioned before, when we utter a sound, the basic unit of sound that we can utter is called a phoneme. If you're a sign language person, the basic sign that you can make is called a chereme. When we put cheremes or phonemes together, we create words which are known as morphemes in linguistics. And another linguistic term that you're all familiar with is something called meme. Meme came from the Greek word mimeme, which means to imitate, but it was invented in 1976 by the evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins in a book he published called The Selfish Gene. And he defined it as being a cultural element of behavior that's passed from one individual to another by non-genetic means. That's really key. With memes, we are able to advance our culture much more rapidly than we could if we had to depend upon changes in our genetic makeup. And in fact, when you really start to look at language and this whole concept of memes, you start to realize that you can look at language as a symbiotic virus that attached itself to our ancestors at some time in the past and has helped to mold us to become better and better carriers and users of this virus. And that we transmit it to our children, and it helps to mold our children into being better and better carriers of it. And it is the reason why we dominate the planet today, and every other animal is at risk to our dominance. When did language begin? Nobody knows. Did it begin once or did it begin multiple times? Nobody knows. Today, if you read the linguistic literature, you'll see estimates from anywhere between 5,000 and 7,000 extant spoken languages. But when linguists look at it and they do evolutionary work to kind of parse what are the roots of languages, to look at the proto-languages, they're able to divide them up into several different branches. And when we look at that more statistically, what we see are the major language families are represented here. This represents something over 85% of all of the human beings in the world in terms of their first language is represented by these 6 language families. And as you can see, Sino-Tibetan is, think Chinese, Niger-Congo, think Swahili, Afro-Asiatic, think Arabic or Hebrew, Indo-European, English, French, German, and a whole host of others. As you can see, there's over 3,200 Indo-European languages, accounts for over 3.5 billion people in the world today. So it's the 800-pound gorilla in the language world. When we look at what languages are actually spoken in the world today, English is numero uno by a little bit. However, English only has about 380 to 400 million native speakers. The rest of them are second language people. With Mandarin, we have kind of the reverse. There's over 900 million native-born Mandarin speakers, so there's only something like 200 million people who speak Mandarin as a second language. And one of the biggest changes that occurred, although very recently, when you look at the historical past, is something we call writing. Writing began probably about 10,000 years ago, but we're not 100% certain, but our information is fairly limited. Not everybody has always been a fan of writing. Perhaps its biggest critic from ancient times was Socrates, who said if men learn writing, they'll cease to use their memory. It's ironic that had Plato not recorded stuff about Socrates, we might never know that he ever existed. And I disagree with him. I think being able to offload stuff from our brains and to be able to transmit it both by distance and time by writing it down is wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. I can read Plato today. If he hadn't written it down, I probably wouldn't be able to know anything about Plato. And in fact, we've taken it to the next level, GAM, Google Assisted Memory. I love the fact that my Google brain is always sitting out there, and it just takes a little bit of work on my effort to be able to recall stuff I didn't know that I knew. Socrates would have been very unhappy. So writing began roughly 10,000 years ago, maybe a little bit earlier, maybe a little bit later. But the earliest examples of what we think are writing come from China 8,000 years ago, oracle bone writing. At almost the same time, 7,500 years ago, in what is today modern Romania, we have the Tartaria tablets. And then from about 5,500 years ago, we have the Kish tablets from Mesopotamia, modern day Iraq. And we believe that those tablets are indicative of the beginning of what became cuneiform. So that's really kind of proto-cuneiform that you see there. When we look at written languages, we see three major groupings, different types. Although to be honest with you, I can't tell the difference between an ideographic and a logographic language. I could tell you an alphabetic one, that's not so hard. And the reason is both ideographic and logographic languages are pictographic. I could read you the definitions, but I don't think that helps. Certainly didn't help me. But one of the things about pictograms is when you look at them, you know what they stand for, regardless of what language you speak, but you may apply a different sound to the symbol. So for example, our Arabic numerals, which should appropriately be called Indian numerals, because they don't come from Arabia, they come from India, they're known worldwide. Everybody knows how to read these things today. But we don't use the same words for it. So we use the word 7. Germans use sieben, and Japanese use nanatsu. Chinese, which is known as a logographic form of writing, has a bunch of characters. Throughout the history of written Chinese, they've used over 20,000 characters. It's a lot. The average literate Chinese person knows between 2,000 and 3,000 of them. And each of those logographic characters stands for a word or a concept. You can use pictograms without attaching a sound or anything to them to tell you what they do. So for example, if you look at the crosswalk symbols that are up there, you know that the upstretched hand, the open palm, means don't take a chance to play in traffic. And the other one means, yeah, go off and risk your butt. And then lastly, in terms of the types of written languages that we have are alphabetic. We have 26 letters, and it's interesting that we have actually 44 different phonemes that we will utter in English. So the way we get around that is we do some combinations like CH or SH to create 44 different phonemes. Because alphabetic languages are an attempt to represent the sounds that we utter in a language. But in Greek, there's only 24 letters, Hebrew 22, and then Polish has 32. Letters evolved over time, as you can see by this chart. I can't take you through everything. The only thing I do know is A came originally from an oryx, which was an ancient form of a cow. But we do know that spelling changes, as does pronunciation. It changes, spoken language changes very, very rapidly. Written language, much more conservative, changes very slowly. And so if you look at this slide and you see the first phrase there in Middle English, dan she gan to spaken dis, early modern English, then she went to spake this, and late modern English, then she went to speak this. And now we've got emoji speak coming up that allows us to say the same thing. I'm not certain how you pronounce it. I am certain that I know how to pronounce this, and probably most of you don't. You're going to read G-H-O-T-I as Gahoti and think, maybe it's an Indian side dish. You'd be wrong. It's much more closely related to the Japanese sushi dish because it spells fish. Gahoti spells fish. Well, it's not as complicated as you think, but this is where the difference between how we speak and how we write really becomes confusing. You can create an F sound from GH, as in enough or tough, and you can create an I sound from an O, as in women, and you can create an S from a TI sound, as in nation or motion. Gahoti, no. Fish, yes. And we can spell a word, we can know how to pronounce a word, but we may be uncertain as to what the word means. And meanings change over time. In fact, when you read Shakespeare today, I guarantee you have no idea what he was really saying because the language has changed. And you don't even know how it was pronounced. Me neither. But I do know that the word peruse is a confusing word because it has two very, very different meanings. The one that a lot of people think means is that you pore over something thoroughly, that you study it, that you really know what's going on. But there are other people, And this is a standard definition that say it's the exact opposite. It means to skim something. Language is complicated. Fortunately, it was simplified greatly by whoever started this thing we call punctuation. The written marks, things that we don't think about, space, a period, an exclamation point. These are really important tools that were added to the alphabetic languages that make them far more productive than they would have been without that. When you look at a cuneiform tablet from ancient Mesopotamia, cuneiform was used from about 5,500 years ago till as recently as about 200 AD. It was used for a lot of different languages. Akkadian, Hittite, Sumerian, Babylonian, they all used the same form of writing, but they had different symbols. Unfortunately, they wrote on clay tablets, which have survived to this day. But you can see there's no punctuation. It's hard to tell when a word ends, when a sentence ends, etc. You read it from left to right, from top to bottom. I can't read any of this stuff. But it's kind of interesting stuff. And if you can read it, you find out that about 1200 BC, there was a collapse in the Bronze Age culture in the Eastern Mediterranean, in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, in Mesopotamia, Eastern Syria, and Iraq, where the civilizations just collapsed. Fortunately, Egypt was able to survive whatever it was that caused this. And as a consequence, which is very fortunate for us, alphabets were able to develop. Because had cuneiform not suffered from the fact that the civilizations that used it didn't fall apart, the sea people, mostly the Phoenicians we believe, but not necessarily limited to them, introduced what would become the direct antecedents of alphabets. The Semitic people and the Greeks picked up on this stuff and developed alphabets. And you can see from the two tablets here, things were not going well in the cuneiform world. Hieroglyphics developed at about the same time as cuneiform in the Nile Valley of Africa, whereas cuneiform was a workaday type written language. It was used a lot in commerce and a lot in the legal system, and that's because we have their tablets. Not so much, we don't think, in Egypt, although it may have started out as a trade tool, it was quickly glommed onto by the priestly set to be used for the pharaonic set to recount their wonderful victories and other deeds. And now most of the hieroglyphics that we have today, of course, are in stone. And that may tell us that we're not seeing a rational sample because maybe the trade stuff was all on papyrus and that didn't survive. But anyway, nobody uses cuneiform. No one uses hieroglyphics today. People still write Chinese, and the reason that they write in Chinese, this terrible form of, thousands of characters, they've simplified them. Beginning in 1950, they went to a simplified form of these characters. But it's a language that really isn't a written language that is really not well suited to modernity. Too many characters to learn. I know all 26 letters of the English alphabet, or if you want to call 52 because upper and lower case, I know that too. But it would be hard to learn all of the Chinese characters. Unfortunately for them, they've had a relatively continuous civilization going back to about 2500 BC. And as a consequence, they never had an opportunity to have an alphabetic language introduced to replace their scratch marks. It's too bad for them because trying to do this on a keyboard is not easy. Modern technology is not favorable to a full logographic written language. Let's talk a little bit about grammar. Two types of grammar in the world today. The one that we all know best is called prescriptive grammar. Don't begin a sentence with because. Don't end a sentence with a preposition. Don't split an infinitive. Gene Roddenberry wrote, to boldly go where no man's gone before, but he should get his wrist slapped because he shouldn't split that infinitive. He should say to go boldly where no man's gone before. I think he got it right. But a lot of the pedants who enforce the prescriptive grammar have rules that they want you to know which form of who do you use, whom or who, in this sentence. And I would ask the question, who cares? I don't know if you do. I can tell you who did care, and that was Robert Lowith. You may not know his name, but you know his work. 1762, he published a short introduction to English grammar, and he's the guy that said don't split an infinitive, and I believe he's the guy that said don't end a sentence in a preposition. Why? Because that was his bias. Was it correct? Only if you're a pedant who thinks that, there's only one way to do something. There have been many other pedants along the way who have told us what the rules of prescriptive grammar are. Most recently, at least in my education, was the elements of style from Strunk and White. I love D.B. White. I think he's one of the best writers I've ever read. But I don't like their rules. I shouldn't use the word very because they didn't like the word very. I'm going to use the word. But in linguistics, we talk about descriptive grammar. Breath of fresh air. We don't care how people speak, how they write. We just want to know how they do it. What does that tell us about their language? How do they form sentences? Do they use subject, verb, object, as in English, or do they use some other form? Subject, verb, object is the most common method of speaking and writing in the world today. More languages use that as their basic form of sentence structure than anything else. Subject, verb, object. She loves him. There's also quite a few that use subject, object, verb. Not as many as what I just showed you. And so that would be she, him, loves. And then we have verb, object, subject, and that's even a smaller set of languages. Loves him, she. And lastly, we have almost just really a handful or a couple of handfuls of language that at any time use object, subject, verb. Him, she loves. Yiddish being one of them. And of course, if you use all the different possible forms of using those three letters, then you're probably short, green, and a member of Star Wars.
Oh, wait, put your weapon. I mean you no harm. Looking. Found someone you have, I would say. Help you I can. My home this is. And help you I will. Take it to him, I will.
Interesting. Then about 1450, we may have major changes in the technology associated with the written word. We have the development of the printing press, the modern movable type printing press. Johannes Gutenberg gets the credit for that. 1455, he starts publishing the Gutenberg Bibles in the local languages, in the local vernacular, so you could actually now read the Bible in English if you were literate. You wouldn't have to know Latin. You wouldn't have to know ancient Greek or Hebrew. The church did not like this because now you didn't need a priest if you were literate in order to understand the Word of God as delivered in the Bible. And it set in motion a revolution that's still going on today. And the reason for that is now written books became relatively inexpensive. Before that, they were all hand transcribed. If you needed a copy of a book, it took a long time. It was expensive to make. And so there was a limited number of books in the world and a relatively small number of people who were literate enough to be able to read the books. But now, with the printing press, you didn't have to be rich in order to have a library. And if you were somebody who thought, well, I got a bunch of memes floating around in my head and I'd like to infect the rest of the world with my memes, you could now do it and spread those memes economically. You would, of course, write anonymously because you don't want to be burned at the stake by the church for being a heretic, but you could now spread these ideas. And that revolution really started to take off. And of course, by the early 1500s, we have the Protestant Reformation beginning. And of course, the Protestants and the Catholics are at war with each other, killing each other. I believe they've reached détente since then. But the world changed dramatically. There was now pressure for people to become literate and a good reason for it. And there were reasons for people who were literate to publish their ideas, to infect the rest of the world with their thoughts. And then in the 1830s, Samuel Morse invents the electrical telegraph, and the world really starts to kick into high gear. Another revolution. There had been telegraphs, optical telegraphs, that predate his invention, going back to the 1700s. If you ever read The Count of Monte Cristo, which is set in Napoleonic times, an optical telegraph features heavily in one of the plot lines there. But optical telegraphs suffer from line of sight issues, so night, they don't work. In fog or in snow or rain, they don't work. So an electrical telegraph is better. By 1844, the United States government had ponied up several $1,000,000 to build a test electrical telegraph system between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, Maryland. And ironically, the first message they sent comes from the Bible, the book of Numbers. And the irony there is, one, it's in English, and two, that it's book of Numbers. And of course, when you're transmitting stuff, you're using almost a binary system for, dots and dashes for your transmission, which of course is numeric. And what they sent was, "What hath God wrought?" But of course, that changed the world. What's interesting when you think about the telegraph is how complicated a communication system it is. Because you have to have a thought in your head, turn it into a written form, hand the written paper to a telegraph operator, who then converts that written form into the analog signals sent along the telegraph wire. And this operator at the other end hears sounds associated with that, converts that back into letters, back into words, back into sentences, and passes the message along to the recipient. Fairly complex. 1876, Alexander Graham Bell gets a patent on the telephone, and now we're able to send our voices at a great distance instantaneously and don't need a telegraph in order to make that transmission. And things really started to pick up after the invention of the telegraph. And you know that today because you can all instant message and do all sorts of other fancy things with your devices, and you never think about what it took to get there. But I'll tell you this, 1948 is one of the most important years. It's right up there with the year that Gutenberg started printing the Bibles. But you don't know it. And the reason is because these two probably unknown mathematicians published two books that changed the world. The guy on the left, Norbert Wiener, published Cybernetics, or Controlling Communication in the Man and the Machine, in the Animal and the Machine. What he was looking at, and may have been the first one to really look at it carefully, was internal communication. Up until this point, everything I've talked about has been external communication between entities. Now he's talking intra-entity communication. And it took a long time for the world to kind of glom on to where he was, but he was always way ahead of the rest of the world. And we'll come back to him in a second. Claude Elwood Shannon is the mathematician on the other side. He had been at MIT, but in 1948 he was working for the Bell Labs in Manhattan, looking at the AT&T telephone system. And he wrote in an internal Bell System journal, A Mathematical Theory of Communication, which changed the world. People who started to read it said, wait a minute, this isn't a mathematical theory of communication, it is the mathematical theory of communication. And it was, and they published it as the small pamphlet that you see there. If you want to read either of these books, let me tell you, you're going to need a lot of math skills. And if you haven't looked at math in a long time, or you're never very good at it, don't waste your time. Neither of them is very long, but they do require a good mathematical grounding. However, I can take this page from Shannon's book, which is the schematic that he created, pretty much anybody can understand, in how a communication system works. 5 big boxes, a few arrows, and you're done. Now, to my knowledge, no one had ever done this before him, so it's pretty seminal. And when you think about a communication system, in this one, this is an oral or audible communication where I'm talking and you're hearing. Right? And so the source is my brain, the transmitter is my vocal apparatus, the signal are the sound waves that I am sending to you, the receiver are either your ears or your hearing aids, and of course the destination is your brain, because I'm trying to infect you with my thoughts and change you. And along the way, there's always noise introduced in any communication system, whether it's internal or external. So in this room, some of that noise can be the HVAC system, or it could be your neighbor making noise, or their phone making noise, or you tapping your foot or clicking a pen. In Shannon's book, one of the things that he spent a lot of time on is how do you distinguish noise from signal? Because it isn't as easy as you think. We do it naturally, right? We can, as long as the background noise isn't too loud, we're really good at just filtering that out. If you're in a very loud, crowded bar or something, you may not be able to. But other than that, your system is really good at it. He had to figure out, how does the Bell system do this? And of course, with the advent of digital communications, that becomes somewhat easier because you can just tell whether you sent a 1 or an O. Is it a 1 or is it an O? If not, then it's noise. Cybernetics took a lot longer to kind of capture the imagination of the scientific community and make its way out into the real world. But it's here now. You just may not realize it. It may not be called cybernetics. The first public instance that I know of people thinking about cybernetics is the $6 Million Man, an ABC TV series that ran for several years in the 1970s. Steve Austin, the principal character, was a NASA astronaut. He was critically injured in a crash. And so the scientists at NASA decided to fix him up by replacing both of his legs, one of his arms, and one of his ears with bionic parts. And all of a sudden, he became a quasi-Superman because these bionic parts integrated with his biologic body to make him far better than the original equipment. Now, throughout history, we have used prosthetic limbs like the whalebone pictured here, but they haven't been particularly smart. But we're getting a lot better. If you're like me, you've had cataract surgery and your failing biological lenses have been replaced with synthetic ones. I now have X-ray vision. It's that good. And if you have hearing issues, we augment your ears with hearing aids, or if that doesn't work, we have cochlear implants. And of course, today you can actually get something akin to $6 Million Man legs or arms, because they're making these things. They probably each cost over $6 million. The hand that you see there is part of a lower limb and hand that is attached to the amputee's arm, the bone, the muscle, the nerves, the ligaments, those are all attached, so it becomes somewhat permanent, but it allows for communication, cybernetic communication back and forth between the prosthetic device and the brain. And so the person knows where the hand is, where the arm is. You don't think about this, but this is something in internal communication that always goes on. You know where you are and your different body parts are generally. And you can figure out how much pressure are you applying when you're touching something. Well, so can this hand, and it transmits that back to the brain. And it also tells you what the temperature is of what it's touching. So this is pretty sophisticated stuff. But we're just scratching the surface. We're really just at the beginning of cybernetics and how it will impact humanity. The woman up there, Polina Anakeva, is a young scientist, brilliant scientist. I don't have time to go into her work in any detail. Look her up on the web. You will be amazed, I'm pretty certain. She heads up the materials lab at MIT, and she and her associates and other labs around the world are working on nanotech and molecular tech that is effectively really advanced biotech that will integrate with our bodies in the not too distant future and turn us into something very different than the traditional Homo sapiens. And that really brings us to the era that we are embarking on now in terms of human communication that I refer to as the neural era. We started by grunting, we got to the point where we're speaking, we got to the point where we're writing, we added technology to that so we could move our thoughts along really fast or really far throughout time. And now we're on the neural era where we'll be able to communicate in new ways that before we couldn't. You all know about the digital assistants like Google Assistant or Siri or Alexa. You talk to these devices and they either respond with an answer to a question or they do something that you want, or they frustrate the hell out of you. And we have the ability to speak to write. We call that speech to text. Let me show you an example of that from Google Docs. This is a simple demonstration of using speech to text, period. And you'll notice it got the spelling right, it got the spacing right, it got the capitalization of this right, and it got the period correct. And this is pretty advanced stuff, but we're going a lot further than that. You should know that Facebook, as well as other companies, are working on thought to text. And their goal is to be able to have a system that works at 100 words per minute in the not too distant future. And if that doesn't impress you, how about this? How about the ability to take a voice sample and then use a text editor to make that voice say whatever you want? We call that VOCO, and it's being developed jointly by Princeton University and Adobe System.
This video presents a system that allows people to replace and insert new words in recorded audio narration. Typical audio editing interfaces present a visualization of an audio waveform and provide the user with standard select, cut, copy, and paste operations on that waveform. We present a system called VOCO that augments the traditional text-based cut and paste operations by allowing the users to replace or insert new words using a text editor. Then VOCO automatically synthesizes the new word in the same voice as the narration.
Very early in my life, I separated from my mother. Very early in my life as a child, I separated from my mother.
Pretty interesting, huh? How would you like the ability to speak in your language with your voice and have somebody hear your voice in their language if they don't speak your language? We call that Babylon.
Babylon is a new hardware-software technology that recognizes your unique voice. Babylon takes this multidimensional profile and synthesizes your voice into new languages. Eventually, it's you speaking French, speaking Mandarin, speaking Russian, speaking Spanish, allowing you to speak to anybody and be understood by everybody.
Good morning, folks. Don't forget to bring 16% de chance de pluie à l'aiga. Hors Uchtaba, mercredi, une vague de froid commencera et continuera with the chance of showers.
So we could take all of these technologies that I've just shown you, Babylon and VOCO and speech to text and thought to text, and we could put them in a nano device, maybe even a molecular level device, attach it to your auditory nerve in your head, add a radio receiver and transmitter as well to this little device. We all have them in our heads. This is the future that is coming very, very soon. And I can just stand up here without flapping my gums and think, hi, how are you? And you'll hear my voice in your head in whatever language you speak saying, hi, how are you? And we call that mental telepathy. And that is, in fact, the next level of human communication. And it's not available generally today, but it is doable today. It's no longer science fiction. And so that brings me to the end. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope at least I've entertained you, kept you awake. Maybe I've informed you a little bit. And now, if you have questions or comments, is the time. Thank you very much. I appreciate your attention.